The fact that we still have an oral knowledge of the language, or rather the languages that Zeno speaks, for if Hadrian is bilingual, Zeno is polyglot, which we shall never have of the Latin and Greek of the 2nd century, contributed to this drift towards spoken language in the abyss. Despite the fact that French changed mostly for the worst and in the direction of a narrowing and constraining propriety between about 1550 and the present, many of my characters' phrases would still have come into my mouth just as they were. At the risk of creating the impression of excessive meticulousness, I confess to having turned to dictionaries for every doubtful word, that is, for each word which I suspected had entered the language after the 16th century, or at most after the beginning of the 17th. And those words I ruthlessly suppressed because they carried with them ideas that my characters could not have had in that form. With almost equal care, I did my best to avoid as much as possible every word which had ceased to be in common usage after the end of the 16th century, and which I might have been tempted to use out of a love for the picturesque or the archaic with no other valid psychological reason. It is because of words or phrases inserted to give a sense of period that the, quote, historical novel, end of quote, disqualifies itself as often as it does because of anachronisms. Let me give a few examples. The word Protestant is used from time to time from the beginning of the 16th century, but it still wavers imperceptibly between its current meaning, a member of a Christian religion, and its meaning as an active participle, a man who protests, and subsequently it is laden for the reader with meanings that come from more recent stages of Protestantism. It is above all in its meaning of an armed faction that it is used in the abyss, as is the word Catholic as well. Quote, the Protestant princes, end of quote, quote, are Catholics, end of quote. Huguenot is meaningful only against a French background, and the characters of this novel live mostly in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Moreover, it is almost as aggressively archaic a word as rapier. The words Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists, which have a narrower focus, are more useful for our particular subject. They indicate to what degree these groups were still perceived as separate, sometimes violently divergent, not yet fused into an entity perceived from without as monolithic. The same observation applies to iconoclasts, which sometimes designates Anabaptists, sometimes Calvinists, sometimes both, and which gives us nothing more than what the bourgeoisie of large Flemish towns deigned to know about some dangerous rebels. Quote, members of the supposedly reformed religion, end of quote, is an adequate designation on the lips of ecclesiastics and jurists. When I looked into some of the translations of The Abyss, I discovered that Captain Henry Maximilian spoke of syphilis like a 20th century sociologist, instead of referring to the good old pox of the soldier. The fact that the learned word figures in a Latin allegory composed by a doctor of the period makes no difference, since it became a word of common usage only much later, and then initially as a euphemism. The word bugger suffered a good deal at the hands of some of my translators. Some prudishly rendered it as heretic, which wouldn't have been right except in the 12th or 13th century. Others made it into a sort of good old chap, much too modern, even though the word must have rapidly slipped into that sort of meaning. The sexual significance eluded them, even though it was present in the usage of the 16th and 17th centuries. Patriot, which acquires currency only in the 18th century, would have been ridiculous in popular speech around 1550, yet it's often found in the chronicles of the troubles in the Low Countries. Anticipating by at least 2 centuries the literate bourgeoisie of those provinces in their struggle against the hereditary ruler from Spain, in fact took it from their reading in Greek and Latin, adapting it in their own fashion. It was appropriate to the cultivated speech of the prior of the Cordeliers, my godson, Monsieur de Witham, one of the patriots. The adjective Belgic is another word that caused me problems. Some readers who were not very au courant about the history of the language believed it was born around 1830, when instead it died, to be replaced by the word Belgian, and was rather awkwardly reincarnated in the proper name of a then new nation. Certain worn-out words can serve like a nail to fix a date, and their use is then legitimate. When Zeno emerges from his meditation on time and space and recalls that at that moment he is lying on a corner of Belgic soil, that adjective takes him back into the 16th century. Ancient man, at least when he belonged to that small minority of cultivated minds which hides from us all the other illiterate minds of the time, tended on principle to rationalize the irrational and to move from the particular and concrete to the general and essential, with certain specific exceptions, of course. In history, as I've already said, Suetonius. In art, the carvers of Roman portrait busts, the great minds of the 16th century, again with certain specific exceptions, individualize and particularize. One has only to compare an anecdote of Plutarch with its retelling by Montaigne to be convinced of this. The language of the abyss was obliged to take account of this specificity in practically every line. The vocabulary of the 16th century is, happily, close enough to our own so that a specific word for the designation of a specific object only occasionally causes the modern reader a semantic shock. Had I wished to render every detail of every incident of Hadrian's life, I should have had cautiously to get round the words triclinium, quadriga, and sella corulus, partly to avoid any pedantry, but especially to leave antiquity its aspect of unencumbered space, which aspect is patently false and yet at the same time is also partially true. If one recalls that the Near East or even Italy has always tended toward a simple way of life, even in ostentation. In the abyss, on the contrary, every word referring to an object as well as the object itself is often, for how much longer, familiar enough to us to become, when Zeno's meditation demands it, suddenly unfamiliar, which an object or a word belonging to a civilization too far back from ours could not achieve. For the painters of the Northern Renaissance, objects form a whole with the personage represented and, sometimes, overwhelming him, acquire a disquieting sort of life of their own. So also in the abyss, the objects and accordingly the words that designate them become the expression of a certain rapport or the sign of a certain submission to necessity. Thus, to choose from among many examples, the bowl of soup that Zeno takes in the refectory of the convent after a sleepless night at the bedside of the prior, the blade less than 2 inches long which will open the way to death for him, and the nightshirt he uses to stuff up the space between the door and the floor of his prison so that the guard will not see blood on the floor of the corridor. Each precise word became a part of the conditioning of the characters, that conditioning which most of them submit to passively, but which some, like Zeno, explore and, to a certain extent, manage to rid themselves of, even at the cost of their lives. What I've said about words designating deeds and things should also be said about words which characterize individuals. In Memoirs of Hadrian, even had the book been written in a polyphonic style, and this is a good reason why it wasn't, we would have heard almost no specific differences between the language of Arrian, Attianus, Chabrias, and Hadrian himself. The variants would be ones of temperament. The tone of Trajan, for example, would sometimes have had to be more jovial, sometimes more imperious than that of Hadrian. The intellectual orientations, Stoicism for one, Pythagoreanism for another, Pyrrhonism for a third, would at most have been perceived as subtle nuances. Taken together, these intelligent men belong to an all-embracing culture and, at least at their level of society, speak more or less the same language. The tonal differences among the characters of the abyss form a series of opposing angles, in part, to be sure, because time has not eroded to the same extent the conflict of their opinions, the consequences of which still affect us. In part, above all, because 16 centuries of often badly formed thoughts, or thoughts that shouldn't have been formed at all, have dug indelible furrows into men's minds. Rightly or wrongly, the ancient world seems to us less scarred. The three ecclesiastics introduced into the abyss do not speak the same language, and none of them knows completely, or at least doesn't use completely, that of Zeno. The philosopher and the canon appear to converse, yet almost none of the underlying ideas of the former reaches into the man of the church, who is nevertheless judicious in his fashion. And nothing of the experience of the unfaithful monks really penetrates his legalistic and theological mind, even though he is their judge. They might just as well have lived in another time, in another world. The bishop's impersonal tone is nothing other than that of the schools of his day. It teaches us nothing about the man. The very spontaneous language of the prior exists on at least three levels: that of the former statesman who is well informed about public affairs, that of the director of conscience and the father superior who is strict and austere, and that of the man of prayer. Zeno, with a clearly warranted prejudice prejudice, or a defiance of the church the prior represents, combined with a tenderness for who he is, sometimes feigns not to understand his poignant confidences, but it is no doubt also true that the profound plain song of charity in the words of his pious protector eludes him, at least at first. In contrast, the prior penetrates the mind of his interlocutor more than Zeno realizes, yet he voluntarily places a zone of silence between his friend's overly audacious thoughts and his own. Quote, "Pray do not insinuate a thing which I do not wish to hear," end of quote. The Captain Henry Maximilian, a man with an open mind who has had the experience of certain humanist teachings and is bound to Zeno by shared memories of childhood, hears the words the philosopher speaks. Beyond a certain point, though, he no longer follows them. Princes and merchants confine themselves to their professional vocabulary of merchants and princes. Zeno's language is made out of successive formations. The oldest is the Flemish of the street, the servants' hall, of the more or less clandestine encounters with workmen, which comes back to the surface during the last years he spends in Bruges. The French spoken in his home is already a language of culture. It is also the language of the books he writes and of his conversations with the captain and the prior of the Cordeliers. But the German, Italian, Spanish, and even Arabic from his years of wandering vie for position with his French. The Latin from his scholastic education unfailingly returns to his lips. If he thinks with these various tools of language, he reasons in Latin, or at least with the aid of the logical principles which come to him from that language. That is why I planted a bit of that Latin, which has no connections with that of the humanists, here and there in his talk, like so many signposts. The scientific language, with its mathematical metaphors as they would have been formulated in the 17th century, is clearly not yet his own. The language of experiments, which is his, also belongs to the artisans with whom he works and the sick people he takes care of. German in Lubeck, Flemish in Bruges. One of his distractions in prison will be to contrive an ideal language for himself which is free from any constraint except that of logic. In the chapter entitled The Abyss, where he finds himself on the borders of the inarticulate and the ineffable, words and even concepts become silent. The differing states of consciousness are translated into the metaphors of alchemy, in which float all the recurrent myths of humanity. I believe I came to this spontaneity of language, which is beyond thought or speech, only toward the end of the first section of the book, with very few exceptions, the most notable of which is perhaps the day spent by Zeno in the forest of Huthuist. The first 100 pages preserve the tone of a chronicle. The few conversations are composed of what the author assumes her characters would have said in those circumstances. They do not spontaneously flow from their lips. The account of the festivities at Draenert, interrupted by the arrival of the weavers, is composed contrapuntally, and each voice enters only for its appropriate part, too measured to be anything more than a sonorous tag. The conversation between Zeno and Wiwine is written to the tune of a ballad, but it's hard for me to know whether that was because I was satisfied with that stylized form and that rather superficial level, or whether the young girl herself could not have spoken otherwise, or even the young Zeno, who surrenders to the game. In any case, it doesn't seem to me that complete freedom of language is achieved until the moment when Zeno, matured and already beginning to age, meets his comrade Henry Maximilian again at Innsbruck. From that moment until the end of the book, I had the impression I was a bit farther away from the reconstruction of life in the 16th century and a bit closer to that life itself, 1972. Examples of spoken language which has not been subjected to literary rearrangement. Official report of the trial of Campanella, 1597 to 1601. 1. Report of a spy. A certain Francesco Tartaglia, detained for 12 days in the Castel Nuovo of Naples by order of the royal counselor, Don Giovanni Sanchez de Luna, several times heard Fra Tommaso Campanella and Fra Pietro Ponzio speaking with each other. In particular, on the night of April 14th, Tartaglia and two prison guards, Martinez and Onofrio, heard the following. Fra Pietro called 4 times to Fra Tommaso, saying, I'm going to repeat that. Fra Pietro called 4 times to Fra Tommaso, saying, Fra P. Quote, Ah, Fra Tommaso, Fra Tommaso, Fra Tommaso, oh Tommaso, don't you hear me, my beloved friend? End of quote. Fra T, quote, hello, hello, end of quote. Fra P, quote, oh dear heart, how are you? Take courage, for the messenger is coming tomorrow and we shall learn something, end of quote. Fra T, quote, Oh, Fra Pietro, can't you arrange to get this door open so that we can sleep together? That would be such happiness. End of quote. Fra P, quote, would that God might make it possible for me to give the guards 10 ducats and you, my beloved friend, 10 kisses every hour. I distributed your sonnets throughout Naples, and I know them all by heart. There's nothing I'd rather do than read something of yours, end of quote. Fra T, quote, I plan to give some copies to the messenger, end of quote. Fra P, quote, oh yes, dear heart, but do me the grace to give me some first for me and my brother Ferrante, and then make some for the messenger, end of quote. Fra T, go to sleep now. Good night. End of quote. Signed, Tartaglia. This next conversation was written in another hand. Frati, have you any news of your little brother and your godfather? End of quote. Fra P, quote, they've put them with the laymen, with Giuseppe Grillo and Francesco Antonio Olivieri. End of quote. Fra T, quote, that's where your brother is? End of quote. Fra P, quote, Ferrante is with that bunch of laymen, end of quote. Fra T, quote, oh, what a pity, who knows what will become of poor little Francesco Antonio di Oliviero, end of quote. Fra P, quote, now you see, have you written much today? End of quote. Fra T, quote, yes, quite a bit, end of quote. Fra P, quote, Martinez isn't in the castle and the captain is called for Onofrio. We can speak freely, end of quote. Fra T, quote, you don't know the Spanish, end of quote. Fra P, quote, I know them well enough and their crimes, end of quote. Fra T, do you know if Thomas Asurus is free, end of quote. Fra P, I know nothing. Ask someone on the floor above. Fra T, that's not possible, Fra Pietro. Tomorrow I'll try to slip you a note containing what I daren't say aloud. I hear someone. Fra P, God save us from them. Speak in Latin. They are ignorant and don't understand it. They are silent for a moment. Fra P, there's no one. They wouldn't come without a torch. Fra T, do you have any light? Fra P, no, none at all. Fra T, I see light. Let's go to sleep. Fra P, let's go to sleep. Two minutes of a torture session undergone by Campanella. A, July 18th, 1600. The accused. I feel terrible. They tell him they are going to torture him again. The accused. Please no. What do you want of me? I'm dead. They ask him why he will not answer their questions. The accused. I can't. Assholes. My whole body hurts. Brother, let me down. Have you no pity? They ask him why he does not tell the truth. The accused. I can't stand it anymore. Brother, I'm pissing. And he begins to piss. For a while he is silent. Then he says, the accused. I'm shitting in my pants. Then he is silent. They ask him to speak. The accused. I can't. They tell him to beg the Lord judges for mercy. The accused. Let me shit. My God, I'm dying. They ask him if his dinner was good. The accused. I can't stand it anymore. They ask him the name of the commissioner of the Holy Office who arrested him. The accused. Let me go to sleep. Fra Tommaso. They ask him who Fra Tommaso is. The accused. Fra Tommaso is me. They take him down and lead him back to prison. B, session of June 4th to 5th, 1601, in the presence of two bishops and an apostolic pronotor. Fucking it, bitch. Pardon me, that language in the historical novel, expletive. B, session of June 4th to 5th, 1601, in the presence of two bishops and an apostolic pronotary. They tell him he'll be cruelly treated if he continues to play the fool. He answers, the accused, 10 white horses. Several more impertinent answers. They tie him to the rack. The accused, tie me tight, you're crippling me. Oh my God. They tell him to be reasonable. The accused, I've done nothing to you. Let me go. I'm a saint. Sanctus sum, miserere. Oh my God, I am dead. My dear heart, dead. Oh, they're tightening my hands. Oh, I haven't done anything. Listen. And he continues to cry out, saying over and over, the accused, ah. And he suffers the torture, saying, the accused, oh, where are the soldiers who help me? Please come. Oh, I'm dying. Help me. I'm shitting. They tell him not to play the fool. The accused, let me go, don't kill me, I'll give you a dozen carlins, I've done nothing. They tell him not to play the fool. Then as they were tying his feet, he said, the accused, oh, they're killing me. And when he hears the trumpet calls from the boats in the port, O castle of Castle Nuovo, he says, the accused, blow, blow, they've killed me. They tell him not to pretend, and he remains silent, his head bent down over his chest for an hour. They tell him they will let him down if he agrees to talk, but he says only, the accused, no, I'm pissing. He asked to get down and was let down and said, the accused, I want to shit. And they took him to the latrines, and then he was interrogated again by the Lord judges, and he says, the accused, my name is Friar Tommaso Campanella. They ask him where he was born and how old he is. He does not answer. The Lord judges order him to be put back on the rack. They put him back and arrange him on it. He says, the accused, oh, you're killing me. They order him to answer and not go to sleep. He says, the accused, please be seated, please be seated, a chair, be quiet, be quiet. They ask him where he was born and how old he is, and he says, the accused, help, and he is silent. They tell him to stop playing the fool, and he keeps silent. He bows his head and says, the accused, alas, alas. And when the first hour of the night had passed, they again asked him where he was born and how old he was, and he says to the Lord judges, the accused, don't do this, I am your brother. And he is silent, and they tell him not to play the fool, and he says, the accused, give me something to drink. And they give him a drink, and he shouts out, the accused, help, oh joy. And the second hour of the night passed, and they tell him not to play the fool, and he says, the accused, do not kill me, brother. And they ask him if he is a priest or a layman, and he replies with many impertinences and says, the accused, I am a Dominican, I say mass. And he lists many members of his family and asks for a drink. The accused, give me some wine. And they give him wine, and he says, the accused, oh, I heard everywhere. And he says nothing more the rest of the night, but suffered on with the candles lit, and daybreak came, and they opened the windows and put out the candles. And he still kept silent, and they tell him not to play the fool, and he says, the accused, oh, I'm dying, I'm dying. And they asked him why he was arrested, and he says, the accused, I'm dead, I can't stand it anymore, oh God. And they tell him not to play the fool, and he says, the accused, I'm dying. And the Lord judges command that the torture be stayed, and that he be placed in a chair, and that was done. And as he was sitting down, he says that he wants to piss, and they take him to the latrines near the torture chamber. And the third hour came, and they were about to put him back on the rack, and he says, the accused, wait, brothers. And once on the rack, he says nothing more, and he stayed there, suffering, calm and silent. Then he asked that they lift his feet up a bit because they hurt badly, and they did it, and he rested quietly. And the Lord judges asked him if he wished to sleep, and he says, the accused, oh, yes. And they tell him that if he will speak, they will let him sleep as much as he wants, and he says nothing. Confrontation with another accused. And then they let him get down to eat and drink and go to the latrines, which took an hour, and they put him back on the rack, and he says, the accused, what do you want of me? And he appeared not to feel the pain any longer, and he said nothing. And the Lord judges, hearing that he had asked for some eggs to eat, had him given 3 on a plate, and when they asked him if he wanted anything to drink, he said yes, and they gave him some wine, and the Lord judges said they would give him more if he would speak, and they announced to him that they were going to start the torture again, and he says, the accused, leave me alone. And they ask him why he is so preoccupied with his body, and he answers, the accused, the soul is immortal. And all the time he kept repeating, the accused, I'm dying, I'm dying. And the Lord judges ordered him to be taken down, cleaned up, dressed, and taken back to his cell. And the torture had lasted 36 hours. Signed, Johann Camillus Pretiotus, notary in ecclesiastical trials and transactions of the Archiepiscopal Tribunal of Naples, and a warden charged with taking the prisoner back and consigning him to the jailers of the castle heard him say as they were crossing the royal hall, the accused, and they thought I'd be asshole enough to talk. Official reports, 345, 402, 404, 395. Luigi Amabile, Fra Tommaso Campanella, Naples, 1882.